Hello everyone, so I'm here today with my wrap-up for February, and let's first go to the stats and then we will talk about all of the books I have read this month and what I thought about them. So looking at the stats, I've read 11 books in February and that totals to 3,018 pages, which is slightly more than 100 pages per day, which is about my rate of reading. But it also tells me, well, we will see that later, but it tells me that most of the books I read were quite short, less than 300 pages per book on average, so that's interesting. Most of the moods I've read are reflective, which is always my biggest piece. Informative as well, I think, because I read a lot of non-fiction. Tense, sad, hopeful, emotional, dark and challenging. Normally dark and challenging are a lot bigger part of my reading, but this time it wasn't, so that's something to look into. Pace is 50-50 split between medium and slow pace. Yeah, that's also normal for me. Normally I don't read very fast paced books, so that's interesting. And this is what I was saying, the page number. I wish that Storygraph had more specific page number divisions, but anyway, 64 of my reading was less than 300 pages. Then I read a couple of big books, which is 18%, and then 18% between 300 and 499, which normally it's the majority of the books are between 300 and 400 pages, but yeah, not this month. Read for fiction and non-fiction is also quite interesting because I read 40% non-fiction, which is also not common. Normally it's around 25-30%, so 40 is quite a lot, but I'm not mad about it. And in terms of genre, most of it was historical. I also read some essays, race, classics, magical realism, science fiction, literary and crime. The crime one is also not common for me, and the science fiction, but yeah, that's what I read. Then something I'm really happy about is that I read 55% print and 45% digital, so that split between print and digital is going more towards the print, which is something I wanted to implement this year, so I'm really happy with that. And then in terms of languages, so I've read 8 books in English, 2 in French and 1 in Spanish, which is also a good split, I think. Most of my reading happens in English, but because I'm doing Read Around the World project and I'm now reading around Africa, there's a lot of countries in Africa that speak French because of colonialism, and that means that it's easier for me to find books in French than in English sometimes. So that's why I read a couple of French books and also one in Spanish. I don't remember what. I think it's something that I bought for my birthday when I was in Spain. So yeah, I'm happy with it. If you look at the page count per day, it's interesting because this month it doesn't really follow a weekend kind of structure. It's more of a whichever day I had the time, because some of the weekends have been busy and some of the work days have not been that busy, but it's almost all around 100 pages per day. There is some higher peaks in the middle, and that is also something that's it's interesting for me, because whenever I'm doing a reading project, like in this month I was reading Katie Book's favorite books, there is a point in the project in which I just kind of want to finish because I want to round things up, and then I read more because I really want to finish, and then that's what I found in the middle of the month, that I wanted to finish that project, so I read more, and that's why those peaks are there. Yeah, interesting. So now if we look at the books themselves, the first book that I read is Generosity by Richard Powers. I actually mostly read this last month in January, but I finished it in February, so it's counting for February. This was a science fiction kind of book about this world in which they're trying to find out what makes someone generous and happy, and there is this woman that she seems to always be happy, so the scientists are trying to see if there is a specific gene in her pool that makes that happen, or if it's something more of an environmental thing, which doesn't seem to be the case because she's from Algeria and she went through war and had a lot of issues with that. So they are trying to look into if there is a gene that makes her happy and how they can implement that into something commercial, because it's a capitalist world. And then at some point it is known that this person is the focus of this study, and she's labeled as the happiest person in the world and gets a lot of interviews and all of this attention, media attention, a lot of criticism that comes with that as well, of course. And she's still happy, but she starts to struggle with that also, because most people seem to think that when you talk about happy and generous people, they are this angelic kind of people, but this woman has a lot of character, and she's a fighter, and she's like she likes to go out with her friends and have fun and drink if she wants. It's not like the perfect woman, she's just very happy. She doesn't have to be happy in the sense that other people want her to be, and so she gets a lot of criticism for that, and she starts to struggle with her mental health, and at some point she breaks down because of all the things that are happening in her life, and it's an interesting exploration on what happiness means, but also like our preconceived ideas of the perfect person, and also the effect on social media has on people, even the happiest people. So overall, I think it's an interesting exploration on the topics it touches upon, and I like the characters and the character exploration, but I did not connect with the characters as much as I was hoping to, as much as I have connected with characters in the past from Richard Powers. So this was not my favorite Richard Powers book, but I can appreciate what he was doing and what he was getting at in this. One book that I finished this month was Bright by Duanwad Pimwana, and this was for Thailand, for the Invisible Cities project, and I have a full review of it, so I will link it down below. But basically this one is about 5-year-old kid that kind of gets abandoned by his parents in the neighborhood. Like his mom leaves for another man, and then his dad is struggling to get into a position that can take care of him, so he decides, you know what, I'm going to move out, try to fix my life, and you can stay with the neighbors for the time being. At some point I'll come and pick you up. And that goes on for months, and we can see how the neighborhood actually does take responsibility for this child, and he is supposed to have dinner in a different place each day, and how the different people approach that, which people he prefers and he doesn't prefer, and how lonely it is despite having all these people taking care of you. Nobody really is your parents, so nobody is like your primary go-to. Nobody is taking responsibility for things like this kid going to school and doing well and trying to help with that. Some of them try to help in some different ways, also trying to give him money for him to be able to afford some sweets sometimes and things like that your parents normally do. But it is lonely because you do not have the same relationship with those people that you have with your parents, and it was heartbreaking. But yeah, it was in another sense, this book was focused on the smaller moments in life, and so that nothing really big happens at any point, and that's also, well, at the end it does, but throughout the whole book it doesn't really. It's more about life, simple life. And I would have liked it to have more of a plot and more of a timeline than it did, but other than that, I think it was a well-constructed book. Then the next book I finished was Cathedral by Ben Hopkins, and this is a historical fiction set in Germany in the, I believe it was the 1200s, and the building of this cathedral. And it has been described like the Pillars of the Earth, but better written, and I will agree with that. This was much better written, and it was a lot more complex and had a lot more flesh than the Pillars of the Earth. It had a lot of discussions about the Jews in the community. There were several of the main characters that were Jew, and we can see how they are treated in the society, how they are pointed out, and what role do they play in society. And there was also quite a bit about the politics of the church, not so much about the construction of the cathedral on itself, like the technical details like the Pillars of the Earth has, but more on the political side of things, on who pays for cathedrals and who makes the decisions and stuff like that. And I enjoyed this one, but it is slower, and it's less consumable than I was hoping for, let's say. So I did enjoy it a lot, but I just I felt like it could have been more, maybe more exciting in some ways, less slow pace, and a little bit more. I was expecting a little bit more on the entertaining side of things rather than in the deep discussion, reflective things, which is up to me and my expectations. Is not on the book, but I think it's important to note that that's the tone of the book, because when I saw it described as the Pillars of the Earth but better written, I was expecting a little bit more of that plottiness and that engagement that the Pillars of the Earth has, and this doesn't have that in the same way. This is a lot more on characters. It's more in like Wolf Hall in that sense, but the setting is more like Pillars of the Earth, if that makes sense. So I enjoyed it. Just I was expecting something a little bit different. And then I read Another Last War by Taban Io Liyong, and this is a South Sudanese author, and this book is a collection of essays about what it means to be a writer in Eastern Africa, and the different political stance that you could take, the different struggles that they go through, and a little bit also about the writers that are the pillars of the post-colonial writing in East Africa. And it was very interesting for me to read. I did not like some of the essays. Like is not the right word, but I was just not interested in some of the essays, because I am not a writer, I'm not studying literature, and some of them were very into the literary theory of things, and I'm just not interested in that. So those essays were a little bit out of my interest zone and comfort zone, but some of the ideas that he talks about were really interesting, and I still enjoyed a lot of that. Then the next book I finished was Troubles by G.K. Farrell, and this won the Lost Man Booker Prize. It's from the 1970s. It was written in the 1970s, but it is a historical fiction of 1919 and 1920 in Ireland, when the Irish people were fighting for their independence, and it's set into this hotel that is full of English people that do not agree with the Irish troubles or the Irish fight. And it's actually focused on this mayor that comes to visit Ireland because he met a woman that he thought it was his fiancée, and then some things happened, and so he came to visit her and see if that relationship was still viable, let's say. And it is very well written, but it is focused a lot more on the smaller details of daily life and social life in this setting than I was expecting to. So in some ways it does read a little bit like a Victorian novel. It has that kind of tone of relationships between people in high society kind of thing, with the background of the war. And towards the end, the war does become a little bit more in the forefront, and I like that part better. But yes, for me personally, my taste is more into the political things that were happening, so this was not the right book for me, I think, in that sense. But if you want to know more about it, I will link the blog in which I read this, and I talk about other books that Katie was chose as their favorites for 2022, and this one was one of them, and that's why I read it. The next book I read was La Saison de Banconi by Moussa Konate, and this was a crime novel set in Mali, in Bamako, and it was very interesting to see that setting and the differences, because it's a police procedural, and obviously the police in Bamako is very different from the police in the US or the police in the UK, which is normally the kind of books that we get from crime novels. So it was very interesting to see those differences. I think it was also quite well written for what it was. I think there were some points in which the writing really shined, which is not always the case in crime novels. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm really happy I read it. The next book is Pequeñas, heridas mortales by Belen Gopegui, which is a tiny book of essays that I got when I was in Spain last. I got some books, and this was like an added free book that they added in the bookstore, and it's, I think, 7 or 8 essays about just life, and some of the reflections here are funny, and they're poignant and relatable and all of that, but mostly it just passed me by. Like, I could not point out anything that I learned from this. It was there was no life changing or a thing that made me think other than just a funny joke here and there. So yeah, this was just very okay. And then I also read The Bone People by Carrie Hulme, which was the other book in the favorites of Katie books video that I made, and this is a New Zealand novel about mainly 3 people. So there is this child that does not talk, and he was kind of adopted by a man, Joe, I think his name was, who is kind of violent sometimes, and he has a short temper, and he's also he has some troubles, but he has a good heart. So this boy just shoved into his part of the beach one day, and nobody knew where he came from or who he was or anything, so they just named him Simon, and he took care of him. And he is a Maori man, but the child looks white. Nobody knows where he comes from, so nobody's sure, but he does look white. And then there is this other woman who is also a Maori woman that lives nearby, and she's an artist, and she's a little bit eccentric. But the boy does run away from school often, and one of the times he ends up in the house of this woman because she built a tower to live in, and the boy sees the tower and is very curious, so he comes in, and she treats the boy very kindly, so they kind of become friends. And then the father, Joe, sees that and decides that he's going to, well, he also becomes friends with her, and then their relationship develop more into a romantic relationship, and then things develop from there. And I think it was very interesting. There is some sections in here that are like, I don't know if I can show you well, but there are some sections like this that are indented differently, that are like the thoughts of the characters, and then the rest is kind of the main story. So we got a lot of inside life from these characters, and they are very well written, and they are very fleshed out, and I enjoyed getting to know those characters. Again, this is more of I would have liked a little bit more than just the daily relationships of these people. And there is some political and some social issues that are discussed, especially with the Maori community in New Zealand and how they are treated, and discussions about who really is family, because these three people are not related to each other, but they are connected to each other in a deeper way than they are connected to their own biological families. So there is that discussion in there, and I enjoyed that. But again, I was hoping that there was a little bit more on that side of things, and there was. Most of it was more about the daily life of these three people and the smaller details of their lives, which is fine. It's just not as much my kind of thing. But good book as well. And go see that video in which I read these books if you want more details. The next book I read, I also have a single review for, so I will also link that down below, but it's Violent Phenomena, which is also a collection of essays edited by Kavita Banot and Jeremy Tiang. And this was great. This is about translation. So Tilted Access Press is a press that publishes mostly translated fiction from Asia, and they ask 21 translators to write about translation and their thoughts on translation and colonialism and how they are connected to each other, and this is the result of it. And a lot of the essays do agree that translation is in a way a form of colonialism, because it's making the resources of these people available and mostly palatable to Western audiences so that they can gain something from it. And a lot of them argue as well that we should stop doing that and we should start translating to be true to the original text, and if Western audiences don't understand it, that's on them. Which I completely agree with. And I liked also that there were quite a lot of different voices in this. So there were obviously a lot of translators, especially from Asian countries, because it's Tilted Access Press, but also a few from South America. And there were also some from the US, and there was one Welsh translator that he was translated from Welsh. And there's a lot of discussion as well about who gets to translate things, the race dynamics of translation, and the assumption that you should translate into your mother tongue. And so a lot of people that translate into English are white people, English people, American people. So there was a lot of that as well, and about the recognition of people that are just multilingual and they just have different realities and they live in different realities. I really enjoyed those aspects of it. So overall it's great. There's a lot of great things in this collection, and I highly recommend. And the next book I finished was Camisole de Paille by Adam Ide, which I also read for the Read Around the World project. And it's basically a love story in Niger and the different aspects of a love story, because it's not as simple. Normally the families are much more involved in relationships there than they are, for example, here in Europe. So it was very well written, it was very poetic, and I think the author is a poet, if I'm not mistaken, so that showed into the writing. And it's again another story about maybe smaller moments. There are also big moments, like in terms of relationships, there is like marriages and children being born and kind of that kind of thing. And there's it feels very classic in the storyline, and it's not trying to do anything special with the storyline, I would say, but the cultural background is different and the writing is beautiful. So I think it was a good book. I enjoyed it. And then I read Endgame in Western Sahara by Toby Shelley, which is a non-fiction book about the situation in Western Sahara and all the players into this situation. So Western Sahara was a Spanish former colony, and then it became part of Morocco, but it also has borders with Algeria and Mauritania, and they are trying to be independent. The Sahrawi independence movement have been going on for a long time, and in this book it's often compared to the East Timor independence movement, and this book goes through the main events that have happened since the 70s until the 2000s, early 2000s, because this was written in 2004, and what Morocco has been doing, what Spain has been doing, what Algeria has been doing. Mauritania doesn't seem to have so much of a interest in Western Sahara, so it's not such a big player, but apparently Algeria is, even though the border with Algeria is really tiny. So if you can see the map, this is the border with Algeria. This is, well, the border with Morocco, which doesn't exist because officially, according to the UN, Western Sahara is part of Morocco, and then Mauritania is all of that. But Mauritania doesn't seem to care that much, at least from what I understood from this book. And then Spain, obviously, because it's the former colonizer, also has interest in there, and also because Spain and Morocco often have fights about who is able to exploit the fisheries around the area and stuff like that, and so Western Sahara is a big part of that because it's a big chunk of Morocco's coastline at the moment. But yeah, I thought this was very interesting. Even though the author is obviously not Sahrawi, I do think that he did spend time there and understood well enough what was going on there, and I also tried to find really hard a book from a Western Sahrawi author, but I couldn't find any, so this is the best I could find. The only thing I will say is that I wish this was updated. So obviously this was written in 2004, and so the events that are discussed finished around the early 2000s, and I would have liked to know where this fight is at the moment, 20 years later, but that's not something that the book can give me. It's just something that I have to research for myself, which is a good thing. I think that this book made me want to know more about what the fight is at the moment. So yeah, I think this was a good read. Last book I want to talk about, I actually finished on the 1st of March, but I just wanted to talk about it because otherwise I think I will forget by the time that the March wrap-up comes along, and that's Les Racines de Yucca by Koulsy Lamko, and this is a book that I read for Chad, for the Read Around the World project, and it's about the author moving to Mexico and his life in Mexico, and his reflections on life, and his feelings towards his country once that he's there. I did like some of the reflections. I thought they were funny sometimes and poignant sometimes, but overall I think that there was not that much for me to take from this either. I wish it was a little bit more focused on Chad, obviously, because that's why I read it. So yeah, it's more focused on Mexico, which is understandable, and it's not that the book shouldn't do that. It's just that I wanted something a little bit more focused on Chad. But it's also interesting to see someone from African country that moves to somewhere like Mexico instead of the US or the UK, which is the 90% of the narratives that we get are people from Africa moves to the US and they have a difficult life, but then they make much better life. That's kind of the standard, right? So this person moving to Mexico was kind of a bit different, so that was interesting. But yeah, those are all the books that I read in February. I hope you liked this video. Let me know in the comments if you have read any of these books, if you are interested in any of these books, and let's have a conversation. And until next video, bye!